A factory floor in 1965 looked nothing like it does today. Machines ran without guards. Workers handled toxic chemicals without gloves, masks, or ventilation. Noise levels in some plants were so high that permanent hearing damage was not a risk, but a certainty. If you were injured on the job, you were on your own. Your employer had no legal obligation to provide a safe workplace because no federal law said they had to. And in 1965, that had been the case for the entire history of the United States. For nearly 200 years, America had no comprehensive federal law requiring employers to keep their workers safe. State laws existed in some places, but they were scattered, narrow, and almost impossible to enforce. The result was that millions of Americans went to work every day in conditions that would be illegal today, and the government's official position was that the relationship between an employer and an employee was a private matter that Washington had no business interfering with. That did not change until 1970. And the road to that change was longer, harder, and more frustrating than almost anyone realizes. The problem began with the Industrial Revolution itself. In the decades after the Civil War, America industrialized at a staggering pace. Factories, steel mills, textile plants, and meatpacking operations sprang up across the Northeast and Midwest, transforming cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, and New York into centers of manufacturing output that rivaled anything in Europe. The workers who filled those factories were overwhelmingly young, poorly trained, and often recently arrived from countries like Italy, Ireland, Poland, and Russia. They spoke little English, had no experience with industrial machinery, and were given almost no instruction before being put to work alongside equipment that could maim them in seconds. The factories of the late 1800s were landscapes of unguarded hazards. Spinning belts, exposed gears, open pulleys, and unprotected blades filled the factory floor. Workers, including children as young as 10 and 12, operated these machines for 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. There were no safety guards on any equipment and no protective gear of any kind. No goggles, no gloves, no ear protection, no helmets. If a worker caught a sleeve in a spinning belt and lost an arm, the employer bore no legal responsibility whatsoever. No workers' compensation system existed. Nobody was required to report the incident to any government authority or investigate what went wrong to prevent it from happening again. The worker was simply replaced by the next person in line and the machine kept running. The steel industry was among the worst. In the mills of Pittsburgh, men worked 12-hour shifts in front of blast furnaces that radiated heat so intense it could blister skin from several feet away. Molten steel splashed and spilled with regularity. The floors were slick with oil and water. Workers handled heavy equipment with no harnesses, no fall protection, and no emergency procedures. The accident rate in American steel mills in the late 1800s was among the highest of any industry in the world, and the steel companies treated it as an acceptable cost of production. In the coal mines of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, conditions were even more dangerous. Miners worked underground in tunnels that were often poorly ventilated, allowing methane gas and coal dust to accumulate to explosive levels. Cave-ins were common. The tools were primitive. Miners breathed coal dust for years, developing a condition called black lung disease that gradually destroyed their ability to breathe. Mine operators regarded these hazards as inherent to the work, not as problems that needed solving. The earliest attempts at regulation happened at the state level, and they were inadequate from the start. In 1877, Massachusetts passed the first factory inspection law in the country, authorizing state inspectors to examine working conditions in factories and report their findings. Other northeastern states followed over the next 2 decades with their own versions. New York established a Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1883. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New Jersey passed factory inspection laws in the 1880s and 90s. But these laws were limited in every way that mattered. They covered only certain industries, usually textile and garment factories in the major cities. They employed only a handful of inspectors to cover thousands of workplaces. A state might have 2 or 3 inspectors responsible for hundreds of factories, making meaningful oversight physically impossible. The laws set few specific standards, leaving inspectors to make subjective judgments about what was safe enough. And the penalties for violations, when they were enforced at all, were so small that employers treated them as a minor cost of doing business rather than a reason to change their practices. A factory owner who was fined $25 for failing to guard a piece of dangerous equipment could simply pay the fine and continue operating exactly as before. The fine was cheaper than fixing the machine. The garment industry in New York City became the most visible symbol of the failure of state regulation. Sweatshops packed hundreds of workers, mostly young immigrant women from Italy and Eastern Europe, into cramped upper floors of commercial buildings. The buildings were not designed for manufacturing. They had narrow stairwells, inadequate fire escapes, and doors that were locked from the outside to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing materials. The workers sewed garments at piece rates, earning pennies per item for 12 to 14 hours a day in rooms where fabric scraps and oil-soaked rags accumulated on the floor. In March of 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the fabric and paper that littered the workspace. Workers on the 8th floor escaped down the stairs. Workers on the 10th floor made it to the roof. But workers on the 9th floor found themselves trapped. The building's single fire escape buckled and collapsed under the weight of the workers trying to use it. The doors to the stairwells on the 9th floor were locked. The elevators could carry only a few people at a time. 146 workers never made it out of the building that day, and the entire disaster unfolded within less than half an hour. The Triangle Fire horrified the nation. Newspapers published photographs that showed the scale of the disaster. Public outcry was enormous and immediate. The tragedy led to a wave of state-level safety reforms, particularly in New York, where a factory investigating commission headed by future Senator Robert Wagner and future Governor Al Smith spent 4 years examining conditions in factories, bakeries, canneries, and tenements across the state. The commission's work resulted in 36 new state laws covering fire safety, building codes, and factory conditions. Frances Perkins would witness the fire firsthand from the sidewalk below and would later become the first woman appointed to a presidential cabinet, called it the day the New Deal was born. But the reforms that followed were state reforms, confined to New York and a handful of other progressive states. There was still no federal workplace safety law, and there would not be one for another 59 years. The pattern repeated itself throughout the first half of the 20th century. A disaster would occur, public outrage would follow, some limited state-level reform would pass, but the issue would inevitably fade from public attention until the next catastrophe. The underlying problem, that there was no federal authority over workplace safety and no federal agency with the power to set and enforce standards across all industries, was never addressed. The reasons for this inaction were the same reasons that had blocked regulation in every other area of American life. Industry lobbyists argued that federal regulation would be too expensive, too intrusive, and too burdensome for businesses to comply with. They warned that safety requirements would raise costs, reduce profits, and force companies to lay off workers or move abroad. They argued that the free market would self-correct, that employers had a natural incentive to keep their workers safe because replacing injured workers was expensive. And they pointed out that state laws already existed, conveniently ignoring the fact that those state laws covered only a fraction of industries and were almost never enforced with any rigor. Organized labor pushed back, but the labor movement's political power waxed and waned over the decades. The American Federation of Labor, and later the Congress of Industrial Organizations, made workplace safety a priority in their lobbying efforts, but their influence was concentrated in unionized industries. Millions of workers in non-union shops, in small factories, on construction sites, and in agricultural operations had no organized voice advocating for their protection. World War II temporarily improved some conditions as the War Production Board imposed safety requirements on defense industry plants to keep workers healthy enough to maintain production. But those requirements applied only to war-related manufacturing and expired when the war ended. In the post-war boom of the 1950s, as American industry expanded into new sectors like chemicals, plastics, electronics, and aerospace, the hazards multiplied faster than any state regulatory system could keep up with. New chemical compounds were being introduced into manufacturing processes at a rate of several hundred per year, and almost none of them had been tested for long-term health effects on the workers who handled them daily. By the early 1960s, a growing body of scientific evidence was making the case for federal action increasingly difficult to ignore. Researchers were documenting the connections between workplace chemical exposures and cancers, lung diseases, and neurological damage that often did not appear until years or decades after the initial exposure. The old argument that workers could simply choose to leave dangerous jobs was wearing thin. Most workers in hazardous industries had no alternative employment available, and no way to know what chemicals they were being exposed to, because their employers were not required to tell them. Representative William Steiger of Wisconsin would later calculate that in the 25 years before OSHA was created, more than 400,000 Americans had been harmed by work-related accidents and disease, and close to 50 million more had suffered disabling injuries on the job. Those numbers were not a secret. They were published annually by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and reported in newspapers across the country. Every member of Congress had access to the data. Everyone in Washington knew the scale of the problem and had known for years. The data was right there on their desks. The question was whether anyone would summon the political will to do something about it. One of the worst examples happened in the hills of West Virginia during the Great Depression. In 1930, construction began on the Hawk's Nest Tunnel, a 3-mile excavation through Gauley Mountain designed to divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric plant operated by a subsidiary of Union Carbide. Approximately 5,000 workers were hired for the project, earning 25 cents an hour for 60-hour weeks. Most of them were African American men who had come to West Virginia desperate for work during the worst economic crisis in American history. The pay was terrible, but during the Depression, terrible pay was better than no pay at all. The workers were drilling and blasting through solid rock inside the mountain. That rock turned out to be almost pure silica. When silica dust is inhaled, the microscopic crystals embed themselves in the lungs and cause an incurable disease called silicosis, which slowly and irreversibly destroys the ability to breathe. The company knew about the danger. Silicosis was already a well-documented occupational hazard in mining and tunnel construction, recognized by medical authorities for decades. But the workers were given no protective equipment, no masks, no respirators, and no warning about what they were breathing. Wet drilling techniques, which suppress dust and are the standard prevention method for silica exposure, were reportedly used only when inspectors visited a site. The rest of the time, workers drilled dry, filling the tunnel with clouds of invisible, lung-destroying particles that they inhaled with every breath. Workers began falling ill almost immediately. The symptoms, chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, and extreme fatigue, appeared within months rather than the years that silicosis typically takes to develop. The concentration of silica dust inside the tunnel was so extreme that workers were developing an accelerated form of the disease that overwhelmed their lungs in a fraction of the normal timeline. The company diagnosed them with a fictional condition it called tunnelitis to avoid liability. Workers who became too sick to continue were let go and replaced. Many had no medical care and no savings to fall back on. Within 5 years of the project's completion, at least 764 of the workers who had spent 2 or more months inside the tunnel had fallen gravely ill. Some estimates put the total significantly higher, perhaps over 1,000. Many of the African American workers who fell ill were buried in unmarked graves on a nearby farm, their identities and their stories erased along with any evidence of the scale of the disaster. A congressional subcommittee investigated in 1936 and issued a report condemning the conditions at Hawk's Nest. Representative Vito Marcantonio of New York called the Hawk's Nest project the most barbarous example of industrial cruelty in the history of this country. But the subcommittee had no power to subpoena the employer, who refused to testify voluntarily. The investigation resulted in public condemnation and precisely 0 federal safety requirements. The worst industrial tragedy in American history produced no lasting federal legislation of any kind. The tunnel still operates today, generating hydroelectric power as if nothing ever happened there. If you're finding this valuable and want to see more deep dives into the hidden stories that shaped America, hit that subscribe button. We cover the history behind the systems and institutions you deal with every single day. Now let me tell you what it took to finally force Washington to act. For the next 3 decades, the situation barely improved. State workplace safety laws remained the only protection American workers had, and they remained grossly inadequate. State inspectors were underfunded and outnumbered. Many industries were not covered at all. Agricultural workers, construction workers, and small shop employees often fell outside the scope of state regulations entirely, and the penalties for violations remained so weak that compliance was essentially voluntary. By the 1960s, the scale of the problem was impossible to deny. Roughly 14,000 American workers were being harmed on the job every year. Another 2.5 million suffered workplace injuries that ranged from broken bones and burns to permanent disability. And those numbers were getting worse, not better, as new industries introduced new hazards that existing state laws did not even attempt to address. Chemical plants exposed workers to toxic substances that caused cancer and organ damage, often years or decades after the initial exposure. Workers handled benzene, vinyl chloride, and dozens of other known carcinogens without any federal limits on how much exposure was acceptable. Asbestos was used in construction, shipbuilding, and manufacturing on a massive scale, and millions of workers breathed in the microscopic fibers that would later cause mesothelioma and lung disease. The asbestos industry had known about the dangers since the 1930s, but had suppressed the research to protect its profits. Textile workers in cotton mills across the South developed brown lung disease, medically known as bisonosis, from breathing cotton dust on the factory floor. The condition caused chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, and long-term respiratory damage. Cotton mill owners insisted the disease did not exist, even as their workers gasped for air after decades on the job. Coal miners continued to contract black lung disease at alarming rates, with estimates suggesting that 1 in 5 long-term miners would develop the condition. Construction workers fell from scaffolding and rooftops with no fall protection requirements. Industrial workers operated presses, lathes, and cutting machines with no machine guards. Farm workers were exposed to pesticides in the fields without any protective equipment or exposure limits, and in nearly every one of these industries, the workers most affected were the people with the least political power: immigrants, minorities, and low-wage laborers who could not afford to quit and had no union representation to advocate on their behalf. The 1960s also saw the first serious scientific research into the long-term health effects of workplace chemical exposure. Researchers began documenting the connections between specific industrial chemicals and specific diseases, creating a body of evidence that made the case for federal regulation increasingly difficult to dismiss. Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, who would become the primary Senate champion of workplace safety legislation, pointed to the research and declared that the situation was not improving but deteriorating, and that the need for federal action was urgent. In November of 1968, the issue was forced into the national spotlight by a disaster that Americans could not look away from. On the morning of November 20th, an explosion tore through the Console No. 9 coal mine near Farmington, West Virginia. The blast was strong enough to be felt 12 miles away in Fairmont. Smoke, flames, and debris shot out of the mine entrance. Of the 99 miners working underground that morning, 21 managed to escape. 78 others were trapped below ground. Rescue efforts stretched on for days. Crews worked around the clock in unstable gas-filled tunnels trying to reach the trapped miners. After 9 agonizing days, the decision was made to seal the mine. The families gathered at the entrance were told that nobody else was coming out. Investigations later revealed that a safety alarm on one of the mine's ventilation fans had been intentionally disabled, preventing detection of a fan failure that allowed explosive methane gas to build up in the tunnels. The Farmington disaster became a national story. Television cameras broadcast the rescue efforts and the grieving families into living rooms across the country. United Mine Workers President Tony Boyle enraged the public by initially defending the mining company rather than the workers, a response so tone-deaf that it eventually contributed to his removal from the union presidency. Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall delivered a speech referencing Farmington directly, declaring that the country would no longer accept the industry's safety record. Congress responded with the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, the toughest mining safety law in American history up to that point. The law required federal inspections of every coal mine in the country, mandated minimum ventilation standards, and gave inspectors the authority to shut down mines where hazards posed an immediate threat to workers. President Nixon signed it into law in March of 1970, but the Coal Mine Act covered only miners. Millions of workers in factories, construction sites, chemical plants, and other industries still had no federal protection. The push for a broader law had been building for years. President Lyndon Johnson had proposed comprehensive workplace safety legislation in 1968. But the bill stalled in Congress amid opposition from business groups who argued that federal regulation would be too expensive and too intrusive. The National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce lobbied aggressively against any bill that gave the federal government enforcement power over private workplaces. The campaign for workplace safety legislation found its most effective public advocate in Ralph Nader, the consumer activist who had already transformed the automobile industry with his 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Nader turned his attention to workplace hazards in the late 1960s, organizing researchers, publicizing conditions in dangerous industries, and pressuring Congress to act. Tony Mazzocchi, the secretary-treasurer of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, became the labor movement's most passionate voice for the bill, traveling the country and testifying before Congress about the chemical exposures his union members faced daily. The legislative fight that followed was intense and lasted more than 2 years. Democrats, backed by organized labor, wanted a strong bill that gave the Department of Labor the authority to both set safety standards and enforce them. Republicans, backed by business interests, wanted to split that authority, creating a separate body to judge violations so that the agency setting the standards would not also be the one punishing employers. The disagreement kept the bill in congressional limbo through most of 1969 and all of 1970. The breakthrough came in November of 1970, when Republicans agreed to create a new agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, housed within the Department of Labor, with the power to inspect workplaces and issue citations. Democrats agreed to the creation of a separate Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission to adjudicate disputes. With the compromise in place, both houses of Congress passed the bill in a lame duck December session. On December 29, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act into law at a Department of Labor ceremony attended by both union leaders and business executives. The law established, for the first time in American history, a comprehensive federal requirement that employers provide workplaces free from recognized hazards. It created OSHA with the authority to set safety and health standards, conduct workplace inspections, and impose penalties on employers who violated the rules. It also created the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health to conduct research on workplace hazards and recommend standards. OSHA went into operation on April 28, 1971. The agency immediately adopted existing industry consensus standards as its initial baseline, giving it thousands of enforceable rules on its first day. In its early years, OSHA focused on the most obvious physical hazards, conducting workplace inspections and issuing citations to employers who failed to guard machinery, provide fall protection, or maintain safe conditions. The agency's first major health standard, adopted in 1974, limited workers' exposure to vinyl chloride, a chemical used in plastics manufacturing that had been linked to liver cancer. Over the following decades, OSHA developed specific standards for the most dangerous workplace hazards. It set asbestos exposure limits that eventually led to the near elimination of asbestos from new construction. It established cotton dust protections that dramatically reduced brown lung disease among textile workers. It created noise exposure standards that required employers to provide hearing protection in loud environments. It mandated fall protection for construction workers at heights above 6 feet. It required machine guards on industrial equipment. And it set chemical exposure limits for hundreds of toxic substances, forcing employers to monitor air quality, provide protective equipment, and train workers on the hazards they faced. The agency was not without controversy. Business groups complained that OSHA standards were too burdensome, too expensive, and too detailed. Small business owners argued that compliance costs were disproportionate to the benefits. Some early OSHA standards were widely mocked for their specificity, including a regulation that prescribed the exact specifications for portable wooden ladders. But the overall trajectory was clear, and the numbers proved it. The results were dramatic and measurable. Since OSHA's creation, workplace injuries and illnesses have fallen by roughly 60%. During the same period, American employment nearly doubled from 56 million workers at 3.5 million work sites to over 105 million workers at nearly 7 million sites. The reduction in harm happened while the workforce grew, which means the rate of improvement was even larger than the raw numbers suggest. The agency's impact extended far beyond the specific standards it enforced. The existence of OSHA changed the culture of American workplaces fundamentally and permanently. Employers who had never thought about safety began conducting training, providing protective equipment, and designing workplaces with hazard prevention in mind, not because they suddenly developed a conscience, but because the law now required it and federal inspectors could show up at their door unannounced at any time. The story of workplace safety in America follows a pattern that should look familiar by now. For nearly 2 centuries, the evidence of the problem was overwhelming. Workers were being harmed in factories, mines, tunnels, and chemical plants at rates that were documented, reported, and ignored. State laws were passed and proved inadequate. Disasters occurred with grim regularity, each one generating a brief burst of public outrage that faded before any lasting reform could take hold. Industry lobbyists spent millions ensuring that Congress never passed a comprehensive law. It took the worst mining disaster in a generation, a consumer advocate who had already proven that regulation worked in another industry, a labor leader who spent years building a coalition, and a political compromise between 2 parties that could not agree on anything else to finally give American workers what workers in many other industrialized countries had enjoyed for decades: a legal right to a safe workplace. Every hard hat on a construction site, every guardrail on a factory floor, every chemical warning label on a storage drum, every pair of safety goggles hanging next to a machine traces back to a law that did not exist before December of 1970. The next time you see a safety sign at work, remember what the alternative looked like. It looked like a tunnel full of silica dust where nobody was given a mask. It looked like a coal mine where someone disabled the alarm. It looked like a factory floor where the machines had no guards and the doors were locked from the outside. That was the American workplace for nearly 2 centuries, and it only changed because the people who worked in those conditions refused to accept them as permanent.